Thank you. I'm reflecting on our mother for Earth Month. My introduction to serious work for Mother Earth was when I was blessed with the weekly presence of Indigenous people. Those women and men who taught me that all life is sacred. More on this later. According to the World Wildlife Fund's 2016 report, if current levels of consumption continue into 2050, then the world's population will need the natural resources and energy produced by two planet Earth, two. Who's using this up? According to Save the Water, the average African family uses 5 gallons of water a day. For the average US American family, it's 2,000. We don't just use water directly. We use it up if we're eating meat, especially beef, at every meal. The amount of water and land needed to raise cattle is far more than it takes to raise chickens, and horrendously more than raising vegetable protein. And the military. According to Watson Institute and Brown University, the US military has emitted 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases since the beginning of their so-called war on terror, twice as much as all of the US cars on the road in the US. That's the US military. This is a graph put on by the World Wildlife Fund. You see all those circles represent nations. The size is proportionate to their population, and the colors code, they're color coded according to region, orange being Africa and blue being Europe. Now, if you look at this line right here, this dotted line going across horizontally, this is the threshold. If the nation goes above that, they're using up more biocapacity than they're using up more resources than the biocapacity can stand. This vertical line over here is how well the nation is doing in terms of giving their people what they need, their basic human development. So we see these countries over here who are way past the blue and the green, a few red, which is the US and the others. A few of these are giving their average people, on the average, what they need to have healthy and happy lives. But if they're above this line, they're doing it at the expense of the earth. So we want to bring all of these countries down below their ecological footprint line. And we want to bring these underdeveloped countries over to the right. We want to see everybody in this area right here where meets maximum levels for sustainability. And the only country here that's in this is Cuba. So going back. So what do Abrahamic faiths tell us about respecting the earth? First, Islam. The Quran says, whithersoever you turn, there is the presence of God. In other words, nature itself is sacred. It further says, it is God in whose hands is the dominion over all things. And assuredly, the creation of the heavens and earth is greater than the creation of human beings. Hebrew and Christian scriptures say that God gives humanity dominion over nature, but there's been a long debate over the meaning of the word that's translated into dominion. Does it mean hegemony or stewardship? Personally, it seems strange to me that anyone can wrap their minds around the idea that the creator was saying, I made this all for you, so if any of you would like to enrich yourself by destroying it, be my guest. This concept was parodied by Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Schwartz, the lyricist of Mass. God said, take charge of my zoo. I made these creatures for you, so he won't mind if we wipe out a species or two. On the other hand, there are the two Francises, one saint and one pope. My patron saint and the Pope's is known for his love of nature. From brother, sun, and sister moon to people to the smallest animals. Once I started learning about the relationship of indigenous people to nature, I came to call St. Francis a white Indian. And Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, speaks of St. Francis and then details his own plans that deal with pollution and climate change, issue of water and loss of biodiversity, and decline in the quality of life and the breakdown of society. Okay, a word about my religion in terms of the earth. Spiritually, my faith is in that which I received from the people whose ancestors have lived here for centuries. I find I worship intensely in nature. Even sitting here on the lawn writing this, looking up at the myriad of branches and blue sky above me, fills me with a joy and an awe, a sense of connectedness that I don't feel in churches. I'm closing with the words of the indigenous John Trudell, who told us, excuse me, people say that mankind is destroying the earth. That is arrogance. Humans are not that powerful. The earth will heal herself if it takes her 1,000,000 years. What we are doing is destroying our ability to live on the earth. It's us. It's us. But he also said, we are a natural part of the earth. We're an extension of the earth. We're not separate from it. We're part of it. The earth is our mother. The earth is spirit. We are an extension of that spirit. We are spirit. We are power. So blessed Earth Month to all of you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Carol Francis, for that wise, earth-wise reflection today. Really appreciate you and what you shared.
Thank you, Carol Francis. Yes.
Anyone have any comments that you want to make before we move on?
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning John Trudell. He was a powerful artist and spoken word, did some great stuff with musicians. So I encourage anybody to check him out.
I could spend my whole reflection just quoting John Trudell.
Yes.
All right. I think our next order of business is to hear our wonderful speaker who's come today, Vijay. So who will be introducing him?
I can do that. I can do Vijay and Kendall. I think you're going to go first, right? So I'm going to introduce you. So thank you guys for joining. This is a great basically honor for me. I've admired the work that Vijay and Street Symphony have done for a long time, as well as other people on this call and on the ICUJP board. It's just a great example of using your own facility in order to make change in your own community. Since 2011, essentially, it's provided thousands of musical experiences for people experiencing homelessness, incarceration, addiction, and poverty in LA County. And, Vijay started this organization. I believe when you started it, you were part of the LA Phil. You're one of the violinists with the LA Phil. So, that's a great connection to our city. So it partners with Skid Row service providers and LA County jails to create musical experiences of the highest artistic quality, bringing together musicians from the LA Phil, the Master Chorale, and countless other musical artists from a variety of genres to create music for and with people living on Skid Row. And it's great to have you here. Also, Kendall Moran works with Street Symphony as well. She started working with the Midnight Mission and transitioned to this organization. And the combination of being able to have a background in marketing and being able to network and a passion for doing the work of helping people heal at some of them at their lowest point is something that's really should be admired. So I will send it over to Kendall and Vijay. We are ready. Whenever you want me to show that video, I can do that.
Thank you so much, Rick. I think I will pass it actually to Vijay to introduce himself. And I think he wanted to do the video straight away.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. I just wanted to say what an honor it is to be with you all. And I think this is not my first time speaking for all of you at ICUJP. There was some time ago, I think it might have been 2012 or 2013, early on in the launch of Street Symphony. So I'm really honored to be providing this update to you all. But really just to say how touched and honored I am to share this work with you all. And, hearing Carol Francis and your introduction, your beautiful reflection, the question that Street Symphony really asks is, where does the sacred lie? And of course, the sacred lies deeply embedded in our earth. The sacred lies above us in what we consider to be the heavens. But I also believe that the sacred exists that God exists between people. Mm-hmm. And that betweenness, that sacred betweenness, is also wholeness. The great theologian who's a student of Thomas Merton, Parker Palmer, says that the work of wholeness is to create spaces between us, where our souls feel brave enough to show up and claim our lives, where our souls feel brave enough to claim us, to claim our lives, right? So the question for us is, where does the soul show up? And for me, as a musician, the soul shows up. I come alive in spaces of musical collaboration. And so in a sense, the sacred exists as perhaps an objective entity outside us, but the sacred can also be created. And in that sense, Street Symphony is part of evoking and invoking the sacred in places that we are often quick to ignore or consider the margins. Street Symphony works in Skid Row shelters such as the Midnight Mission, the Downtown Women's Center, the Weingart Center. We also make music in Skid Row parks and shelters. But the musicians who participate in Street Symphony, as Rick was kind enough to mention, consist of some of the leading professional classical, choral, jazz, and mariachi musicians of our time, really. We are musicians of the LA Philharmonic, Master Chorale, the Hollywood studios. And so we make music on concert hall stages all over the world. But the question again is, where is the sacred, right? The concert hall is a sacred temple for me, certainly. It's a temple of Mozart and Schubert and Beethoven and all the music that we love. But the community is also sacred. And so with that, Rick, if you don't mind sharing this beautiful video that you are actually amongst the first to see. This video has not yet been made public. And to give you a little bit of context, it is a culminating video that it took us months to create during the COVID-19 pandemic, of our new weekly workshop series, which takes place at the Midnight Mission with participants of the Midnight Mission Sobriety 12-Step Healthy Living program and really remarkable world-class teaching artists. And together, over 24 weeks, they created a series of new songs, and you're amongst the first to hear them. So without further ado, Rick.
Thank you all for being here. Today we have a very special performance of Midnight Strings.
Music is life.
It lets us get out of the think spot and just kind of be.
All the people have something inside.
We all want to be seen and to feel like we're loved.
Our relationship with Street Symphony has continued to grow. Over the years, it's become more interactive, and then they said, how about a class?
Midnight Strings is an 8 to 12 week long program for beginning and intermediate guitarists to come together and share their passion for music. We learn the fundamentals of guitar, songwriting, and performing in a group setting.
You get a lot of new people trying new instruments, learning different vocals.
There's also this constant cycle of sharing and learning and growing, both for me and the people that I work with.
From where I was to where I am now, I was pretty convinced I was going to die. I'm still convinced I was going to die.
I was sleeping in my car because I lost my job.
I had literally nothing. No shoes, no shirt.
Hay momentos en que siento que se me encoge el alma.
When I come to this shelter the first time, I had afraid because I think it's only drug addicts, but you can find anybody here different.
I showed up at the gate, let me in, you know, and then I had like people who were interested in like my life improving.
I came to the class and that's when I met Philip, which was like a big thing for me because Philip has like a vibrant spirit. It forces me to like get in that zone with him.
We usually begin with anything from learning a new technique to learning a new song, and we'll share how that made us feel, what it made us think about.
I'm sorry. It's like what I'm feeling right now.
Yeah, hearing your words is empowering, not just to you, but to everybody.
I thank God I found this class and everybody in it because it feels like it's like group therapy for me.
And then usually that transitions into us doing some sort of creative group work. Sometimes it's a little jam, sometimes it's actually composing an original song together.
We've had a lot of like opportunities to be vulnerable and authentic and create really beautiful, awesome stuff like Grateful Power.
The lyrics for Grateful Power actually came from a writing exercise.
We all came together and put all our input in, and it was really organic.
I really think about this class as an opportunity to build community because music is inherently a social art form.
You're working together with other person. This is the team.
Like, you know how like the wind blows and all the trees are like this? Like, that's how our class really is.
Being a part of a community, I think, is integral to the human experience.
You have the 12-week classes, and at the end of the program, you have like the finale or the final performance.
There was the class performing, but then there were the musicians from Street Symphony joining in.
We have special guests, Son California.
It's almost like a little orchestra. It makes it look classy.
It's a way for participants of this program to share what they've been working on with their community.
That we would care to give us the strength, to give us this kindness.
The strings, like, they make me feel useful.
singing it and performing it. I'm reluctant every time, and then at the end of it, I feel great.
Music has a way of getting into those closed parts of us and opening us up where we can reach somebody.
We do have a captive audience.
You can like feel it vibrating inside of you, so like I can kind of ground myself in that when dealing with all of the real world stuff that's coming.
You can be consumed by what you're surrounded by, right? Music can like empower you. It's actually what keeps me going in this place. Like it's like music.
When you love the life, you want to make something good.
I do want to raise my musician level to where I'll be able to teach.
It's helped me to kind of gravitate towards things that make me happy.
Everybody who does make a mistake, I hope they do get their lives together.
A lot is possible when you say yes.
Everybody join us. 1, 2, amazing.
How do you end homelessness for 69,000 people? One person at a time, with love and trust and patience and hope.
If you're at your lowest, that means there's nowhere to go but up.
For that, Rick. I'm also going to drop a link to the video here in the chat, so that if there was any issues with sound on anyone's end for the video, you can actually watch it on your own device. So what you saw there was a video of Street Symphony's workshops, which take place in the library of the Midnight Mission every Thursday morning. We just had a workshop yesterday morning led by Philip Gralty, who you saw and heard on that video. And these workshops start off with sort of introductory guitar lessons. They might learn a couple of chords, for example, a 1, 4, 5 chord, G, D, and A. And then, a very basic song. Philip gets folks singing very quickly, whether it's to learn a song like Amazing Grace that everyone can sing together. But then, the music often opens up someone and allows for more dialogue and more relationship to happen in the very first moments. When I started playing Street Symphony the very first time when I was a member of the LA Philharmonic, we took a Beethoven string quartet to the Skid Row Mental Health Clinic on Maple Avenue, the Department of Mental Health Clinic. And in the middle of one of our first movements of this stormy Beethoven string quartet, a woman in the very front row of the audience just held out her hand halfway in the middle of the performance, and her hand was like 6 inches from my face. And I had never literally had that sort of contact with anyone in my audience before. I had grown up going to conservatories like Juilliard. I studied at the Yale School of Music. I had always been someone who was on the other side of the fourth wall, someone who was kind of protected by the stage and protected by the bright lights and tuxedo tails. And when I first started making music in Skid Row, there was this immediate sense of contact. But then when we ended the movement, this woman just stood up and she started to tell her story completely unprompted. It was as if a dam had broken in her. And she was someone who was seeking services at the Department of Mental Health. I assume, perhaps incorrectly, but I assume that she was unhoused or experiencing some kind of a chronic mental health issue, which is the case for many people in the Skid Row community who are seeking services from departments of mental health or the Midnight Mission. What happened in that moment was she sensed a sort of moment of connection with this music that I had kind of studied objectively. I had studied how to play this music correctly, but I had never really studied what the human impact of this music was. And that's what she was speaking to directly. And it was like this immediate connection to Beethoven, right? Because the time that Beethoven had actually written this music was the time that he was actually considering taking his own life, because he had just realized that he was going deaf himself. And at the time in 1802, Beethoven wrote a letter, which is now called the Heiligenstadt Testament, because he was in the city of Heiligenstadt. And he wrote, well, the only reason for me to stay alive is to continue creating. The highest good that I can create in my life is to create art. And that's the only reason why I should be around. And so here's this woman in 2010 in a Skid Row shelter saying that this music is her music, Beethoven's story is her story. And so we started to change the way we thought about making music in Skid Row, because these were no longer concerts, these were conversations. And we had, social workers and clinicians tell us that the very best time for therapy was right after a Street Symphony performance. And so we started showing up to places like the Midnight Mission. You saw one of our great mentors and friends, Miss Georgia Berkovich, on that call. And Georgia often talks about the power of music as this kind of Pied Piper force, that perhaps music can bring people in and open people up to the point where they then want to ask for services. Sometimes people don't know what to be asking for. They don't know if they should ask for help, or if they deserve help, or if they want, quote, help, right? But the music might open all of us up to a place of softness, where then a service provider like the Midnight Mission might say, if you're tired of being tired, we have a place for you to sleep. If you want to no longer live a life where you're steeped in an addiction, well, then we have another way. I'm not sure if you heard this on the video, but one of our dear friends, Booker, who was a participant of the Midnight Mission programs at that time, said that he came to the Midnight Mission with literally nothing. And he was so afraid, and so sure, in fact, that he was going to die. And I met Booker in, I think, around 2019, right before the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the time, Booker was not interested in Street Symphony's programs. But as he started to show up, as the pandemic allowed us to come back and be making music, Booker started to pick up a guitar, and he started to sing as part of these programs. And he found his voice. And I hope that you'll have a chance to watch the video on your devices and listen to just how beautiful Booker's voice is. The first time I heard him sing, I started weeping. He started singing Amazing Grace. And one of the most beautiful, pure, gorgeous, clear baritone voices I've ever heard in my life. And now Booker is on the staff of the Midnight Mission. And he is someone who's able to tell his story as an invitation to other people like him in his community. And as a staff member at the Midnight Mission, Booker continues to participate in Midnight Strings, which is just so wonderful. So I'm going to just zoom out for a moment and talk about what Street Symphony actually does. I've mentioned these weekly songwriting workshops, which take place at the Midnight Mission. We also have songwriting workshops at the Downtown Women's Center, and we've launched a new weekly workshop at Inner City Arts, where we're working with at-risk youth. Many of the youth are attending schools like Para los Niños in downtown Los Angeles. Many of the youth might also be living at the Union Rescue Mission, which is one of the only missions in Skid Row which has programming for youth and families living in Skid Row. So Street Symphony has these tracks of weekly workshops, which are led by master teaching artists, such as Philip, who you saw in the video, but also members of the Los Angeles Master Chorale. At the end of these workshops, there will be a new piece of music or a new song created. But parallel to the weekly workshops, Street Symphony also presents monthly concerts, regular concert performances. Just last month in March, I curated and directed a performance of one of the most beautiful Bach cantatas, a spring wedding cantata called Weichet nur. And Weichet nur in German means soften yourself. Just a perfect metaphor for power of spring, the sort of, you know, at the time there was snow on the mountains right outside my studio here in Altadena. I was like walking around and thinking, oh, how perfect it is that the world is melting and we're making room for a new life. And here's this music of Bach. But in the context of the Bach cantata, we invited a Skid Row storyteller, a woman we call Mother Linda, who is a longtime resident, an activist, an artist living in the Skid Row community, to tell her story. And she told the story of creating a painting of her mother's wedding dress. And so we used the music of Bach to actually tell the story of the Skid Row community. And this is actually exactly what Bach's music would have been meant to do in the 1720s, that there was no concert hall in the 1720s. This music was created for a community of people. And it was a way for either a sermon to be told, you know, if it's a cantata like Ich habe genug, which might be told on the Feast of St. Mary, or like the Magnificat or the Passions. These were pieces that were actually created with a community that was involved in telling that story. It was their vernacular. They were not consuming this music, they were part of it. And so Street Symphony also has these monthly concert performances. And you might have heard about one of our perhaps most well-known yearly annual events, which is called the Messiah Project. All of our monthly performances culminate in a sing-along performance of Handel's Messiah, which up until the COVID-19 pandemic happened every year in the gym of the Midnight Mission, the very same room you saw on that video. And at the Messiah Project, we bring together community choirs, choirs that we've helped create in the Skid Row community that are now their own organization, as well as LA Philharmonic, Colburn School, and LA Master Chorale musicians to sing this beloved oratorio. And you might be asking, well, why on earth are you playing one of the most beloved pieces of concert music at the Midnight Mission? But what you might not know is that at the time that Handel was writing the Messiah in the 1740s, he had just suffered a stroke. He was going blind, and he was effectively canceled because at the time in the 1740s, London no longer wanted to hear Italian opera, which is what Handel is famous for writing. And so Handel couldn't find a venue. No one wanted to present his music. And the very first performances of the Messiah in Dublin actually paid off Handel's debts because he was facing debtor's prison at the time. And the very first performance of Messiah was in fact so successful that Handel raised enough money not only to pay off his debts, but he paid off the debts of 140 other men who were also facing debtor's prison at the time. And when the performances happened, Handel insisted that the performances never happen in a royal court or in a grand cathedral, but rather in an orphan's hospital. And Handel himself used to work very closely with the young musicians, the young people living at the orphanage, to train them to sing this music. And the concerts were in fact so successful that King George II attended the performances in the orphanage. And if you've ever attended a performance of Handel's Messiah and you've stood before the Hallelujah chorus, it's because King George II stood in the orphanage because he was so moved by the performance. And when the king stands, what do? You all stand. And so that tradition is what Street Symphony is still sustaining at the Midnight Mission, except we're not standing for a king, we're standing for our community. And we're standing for our community in Skid Row, and we're standing for this sacred sense of connection that we all build together. Street Symphony is also a regular presence in spaces of incarceration. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we developed a close partnership with the Weingart Center in Skid Row, which is one of the largest reentry service providers in the Skid Row community. And through the last 12 years of our work, our dedicated, deep practice in the Skid Row community, which I consider to be a deeply spiritual practice, we have found that Skid Row gets talked about as a place of urban blight. We talk about Skid Row as a slum or a ghetto, but I have actually found that Skid Row is the country's largest reentry zone. I have met people from all over the country who come to Skid Row to seek services at places like the Weingart Center, the Midnight Mission. There's a place in Skid Row which is called the Nickel. It is the intersection of 5th Street and San Pedro. And that is the drop-off point for thousands of individuals emerging and re-entering society from incarceration. In many of the 35 state prisons we have in California, we have 35 state prisons in California. We incarcerate more people than anywhere in the world in the state of California. We also have the largest county jail system on the planet. The LA County jails are a $1 billion, billion dollar system. And so reentry services are critical to not only reconnecting people with their families, but also getting things like SSI, their IDs, getting people back in a system that might allow them to emerge from parole and enter into Section 8 or SRO housing. So Street Symphony kind of straddles the reentry spaces as well as the spaces of incarceration. Prior to the pandemic, we were in all 5 LA County jail facilities, from the Pitches Detention Center near Magic Mountain all the way to the Linwood facility, which is CRDF, the Central Regional Detention Facility near Compton in Linwood, which is the women's county jail. And we are emerging now into reconnecting with our programs in the California state prisons. And next month, we're actually very excited to be going back to the California Institution for Women, which is in Chino. So I see a couple of hands. I'll pause here because I know we want to have a bit of conversation, but I just want to invite you all to a new concert series that Street Symphony has launched called the CROSSROADS series, where you will actually be able to experience some of the music that Street Symphony has created in the Skid Row community alongside a performance by myself. I'll be performing the complete D minor partita by Johann Sebastian Bach. I'll also be performing music written by LA composers Rina Esmail, who you might have heard about Rina because she's currently the composer in residence of the LA Master Chorale, as well as LA composer Peter Nell. And afterwards, we'll be having a brief reception and conversation about the work that we do. And the performance is taking place on April 29th at 6 p.m. at All Saints Church here in Pasadena. So I'll pause there, curious if there's any questions or conversation that we'd like to have. And thank you again. Thanks so much for having us.
Cool. Somewhere behind me also, too, in this stack of CDs, I have the recording that you did with Badal Roy, the late great tabla player, which is one of my favorite things. So are there any projects that you are working on with Street Symphony that either I don't know if you're just if you're mostly concentrating on working with the community at hand and in projects hand in hand with them, or are you working on anything on the legislative level to make change? Because I know that a lot of people might be wanting to try and work with you guys one way or the other.
Well, this is where I'll prime the conversation for my colleague Kendall to come in and talk about a few of the partnerships that we're starting to build, because Street Symphony is not a political advocacy organization. We are a service organization, and yet we're very lucky to have an audience, with powerful and connected and active people who are working towards legislative ends and procedures. And I'm also the co-founder of an organization called Skid Row Arts Alliance, which is a collective of Skid Row-based arts organizations, which include the Los Angeles Poverty Department, Urban Voices Project, Piece by Piece. And Los Angeles Poverty Department are actually one of the longest standing arts and advocacy organizations in the Skid Row community. And they are very, very politically active, from working on items like a new, what they call a green paper. Essentially, it's a white paper, but it's recommendations to the city for legislation, which we call Skid Row Now and 2040. And that is actually a piece of legislation that we're hoping to have passed by the city council. It also includes expanding and preserving what's called the IX1 zone, which is a protected zone for services. Skid Row is the largest concentration of human resources and human services, certainly in Los Angeles, if not in the state, or I would even go so far as to say in the country. And so preserving Skid Row and the possibility of housing and the necessity of housing is so critical that my colleague Kendall can speak a little bit more acutely to the ongoing initiatives and some of our new budding partnerships.
Thank you. Yes, I don't have like a professional background in policy, but being involved with some of the on-the-ground mutual aid efforts during the worst of 2020 has kind of got me involved in just like local politics. Not so much politics, just, for example, LACPC. I'm now attending on behalf of Street Symphony, which is the Los Angeles Central Providers Collaborative. I also watched the city council meetings. And so just kind of knowing everything that's kind of moving through all of that. But yeah, LACPC, there you go. Okay, there's too many things going on. What was the original question?
Well, I think if you could talk a little bit about your understanding of Skid Row Now in 2040 and just some of the work that a few of the other organizations are doing in the Skid Row community. Because, one thing I'll sort of say is that one of the places where policy fails the people who are living in the Skid Row community is the sort of statisticizing of the issues. We talk a lot about the counts. We talk a lot about the need for emergency housing and care. And it was remarkable during the pandemic when we talked about how we needed to house as many people as possible. And in fact, a lot of people did get emergency housing during the pandemic. Either, that was Project Room Key that happened. But what we're not talking about is that more people who were parts of the Skid Row community who had experiences of addiction or homelessness during before the pandemic, a lot of people died of accidental overdoses in the Project Room Key facilities because they were not connected to human services like AA, NA, and these kinds of things that we can't necessarily count. And so the question often becomes, well, what's the need for an arts program for such an at-risk community? What's the need for you to be making music in this community? What a nice thing you do, but what's the actual tangible human impact? Well, the tangible human impact is connection, right? The real pandemic, the real pernicious thing that happened during the pandemic wasn't that people needed to be housed, but rather that people were disconnected. It was a pandemic of loneliness, isolation, and disconnection. And that disconnection is deadly. Disconnection is deadly. And so much of the work that we're trying to do is to keep people connected, not only to healthy living programs and sobriety, but also towards their own humanity and sense of self. So, with that, Kendall, I don't know if that helps to prime anything in your mind, but I also see a couple more hands coming up.
Yeah, there's a couple different things going on in SCID. Yesterday was the LACPC meeting, and there was a very big conversation about the LA Housing Trust situation, how that's working out, and just like the awful conditions that people are living in Skid Row. Once you are in a shelter and you get a voucher, you think you're going to be transitioned to a livable space. And these people are talking about no air conditioning, no heat, no elevators, just like awful conditions for disability situations. And just like, yeah, issues with security, issues like there's no wraparound services. So there's a lot of that going on. I've also been contacted by the LA Times because they are looking to try to find any type of way to move policy around fentanyl and the new drug tranq that is prolific in SCID, and just the devastation of that. And there was a rousing conversation about harm reduction and people's differing opinions of that. So, health, safety, well-being, there's so much going on, which is why it's kind of nice being in Street Symphony, because while food, housing, all of that is extremely obviously important, we also believe that music is to the soul like food is to the body, and sometimes just as important. So we're able to really help that piece. But let's take some questions.
Maggie, would you have a question next?
Yes. I wonder if you have contact with Homeboy Industries.
So I've worked closely with Father Boyle in the past, and we certainly have been very inspired and guided by their incredible work and advocacy. One of the dreams of Street Symphony is to create a similar pathway of workforce development that Homeboy Industries has created, namely through the workshops, which create these new pieces of music. I'm hoping to be in conversations with folks at ASCAP and BMI, to register participants and songwriters of our musical workshop, and actually create some kind of a pathway for them to receive royalties or remuneration from the music that they actually create, which would be just so wonderful. But I should also mention that everyone who participates and performs for Street Symphony receives a professional honorarium. We pay musicians $250 per concert and $75 per rehearsal. And that includes members of the Skid Row community who perform with us. And so, I'm very transparent, and I'm honestly very proud of those numbers, because, for someone who's participating with us as a member of the Skid Row community, participating in a month of Street Symphony programs pays rent. It actually pays rent. And for our professional artists, we started off as a volunteer-based organization. Many of our professional musicians donate back their services. But also, it's very important to me that the work that we create in Skid Row is actually not ever seen or thought about as charity. We're not thinking about what we do as charity. The charitable impulse, of course, is honorable and very, very important. But what we're asking for is a meaningful, and I actually want to say the word professional, sense of engagement. When I rehearse my colleagues, when I practice myself, I'm going to have colleagues in this room in a couple of hours who will be performing for several hours for our upcoming performances in Skid Row. And I think that we probably rehearse and prepare as intensively for our performances in the Skid Row community as we ever would for performances in places like Disney Hall or at LA Opera. And the reason for that is that as musicians, we are worshiping something. I grew up in the Hindu tradition, and I grew up really believing that music was sacred. Music is a sacred act. And so we have a word in Sanskrit called sadhana, so sadhana. I'll type it into the chat. And sadhana means practice. It means spiritual practice. You might have a yoga sadhana, or you might have an ICUJP sadhana. You might have a practice of your own that is related to your own spiritual growth. And that's how we see the work of Street Symphony. So Maggie, I've completely gone off the rails with your question, but we respect and admire the sadhana of so many of our colleagues in the Skid Row community, and we have so much to learn from all of them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vijay. And I notice we have two new people not new people, but people who've arrived, Grace Durness and Michael Novick. Welcome. Do you want to introduce yourselves before we move on?
Sure. I'm Michael Novick here with KPFK, Anti-Racist Action, et cetera, et cetera.
Great to have you with us. How about you, Grace?
Good morning. I'm Grace Durness. I'm right now just having to leave again. I'm sorry for another meeting, but it's great to be here. And Vijay, I've gone to concerts there on Skid Row and so grateful for what you do. And so I wanted to at least come here for a few minutes before my next meeting. But thank you so much and keep up the good work. And we're following and we'll keep following.
Thank you.
You do.
Thank you, Grace. Lovely to see you again.
I'm really excited because I have someone that had just spoken to 2 days ago who was very happy, and I'm trying to get to a place where I can speak quietly, who loves the mission. And you showed him on camera when I saw the information and everything. And he'd rather be there than with his family. And he's a musician. And the work that you're doing, they're grateful for this, the families and everything. And I just wanted to let you know that. And this was just day before yesterday. I had spoke to someone. So, and I wanted to let you know that.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Ruby. That means so much to us. I'm really touched to hear that. I'm really, really touched to hear that. And if you don't mind, I'll share that with Philip, who's actually going to be in this room rehearsing with me later on today. Because it's this work can be grueling. This work can be not only for ourselves, for the musicians, but for our colleagues like Georgia, for our colleagues who work at the mission, for our colleagues like Kendall, who understand what it's like to be in that building at that mission every single day, working so closely with the community. One of the things that we've learned from people in recovery is that for often to truly recovery is terrifying in many respects, but one of the most terrifying aspects of recovery is really leaving one's biological or family of origin. And so often a trauma might be rooted in that initial family. And so, growth for all of us can be terrifying because growth means leaving a family of origin, especially if we want to continue and sustain that growth. I think that's why, in a sense, healing or growth can be really terrifying to us. So I'm continuously in awe of program participants like Booker or Lance or Ladarius or India or the people who you saw on that video. I consider them to be kind of our current day messiahs in the sense that they have a messenger. Messiah literally means messenger. When we're listening to the message of people in Skid Row, it is a message of courage and hope and humanity and incredible resilience. I have to say how grateful we are to our partnership with the mission. And, I first heard about this program that Georgia Berkovich had started called Music with a Mission back in 2010 or 2011. At the time, I was actually cold calling missions, shelters, clinics, even hospices. And I was saying, I would like to come and play. And there were many times I must have arrived at the phone or the ear of a receptionist, and they thought I was making a prank call. I used to get hung up on because people would say, "You're from the LA Philharmonic and you want to come here? Do you know what happens here?" And they would say, click. And when I actually heard Georgia's voice on NPR, and she was talking about creating this new music program at the Midnight Mission. And that's when we started. And I think March was the 91st time that Street Symphony has performed at the Midnight Mission since 2012. And just last Sunday, Kendall led our Street Symphony team in the annual Easter service that the Midnight Mission presents at on Skid Row. And Kendall, I wonder if you can just talk briefly about some of the street fairs. I know we have a couple more hands up, Rose and Steve. Excuse me. I'm gonna let Kendall say a couple of words about some of the street fairs we do, because that's a really exciting opportunity for Street Symphony to actually play on the street.
Yes, so the Midnight Mission street fairs happen on Thanksgiving and on Easter twice a year. So I've done 4, and truly one of my favorite times of the year, just because you see all the people come together and just truly like celebrate each other and celebrate community. And one of the really core parts about why the street fair happens on these days that really is awesome to me is because there is such a culture of recovery, like AA, NA, Al-Anon within the Midnight Mission. And I myself am in Al-Anon. So the concept of not wanting our community to be alone on the holidays, because those are some of the hardest days, especially when you're struggling with addiction. So for example, on Sunday, Mark McKay, who is currently touring on the other side of the country, spent his own money to fly him and his band out here to perform for free at our street fair for our community. And Mark has this like very interesting back and forth with this community member that we all refer to as Cigarette Man, who dropped out of school in the 4th grade and is just kind of like this eccentric character that everyone knows and loves in Skid Row, unless you catch him on a bad day. It's not as fun, but it's like Cigarette Man every time will just be like dancing in front of the stage, and he'll be going back and forth with Mark, requesting different music. And Mark is like, yeah, sure, whatever. So he's playing like the Eagles or something. And it's just like being in that, out in the street, and we have all these volunteers. Tom Morello was here on Thanksgiving, as was, what's her name? I'm awful with actor names, but Charlize Theron. Mr. T did our invocation on Sunday. So it's like we have these like celebs, B-listers, we have corporate volunteers, we have community volunteers, we have alum of the program, people who work at the Midnight Mission or who used to work coming in on their days off. And probably my favorite moment of this past Sunday was just kind of being in the middle of all of it. And this guy is standing next to me and is like complimenting the show and saying, oh, this is awesome, like this is cool, whatever. And he asked what my role was in it. And I said, I was actually the event lead. I put it all together. And he said him and all of the guys that he was with they were actually on the 9th floor of Weingart, and they saw out the window the street fair happening and asked their like floor manager if they can go. And the floor manager was like, let's all go. And so they all just like emptied out the floor and came over and were just like joining the party with us. And it's just like little moments like that I just really, really appreciate, being able to just like be with this community and like listen to the music. And, we had the Ashe Ashe drummers perform during Mark McKay's band break. And that just is a whole different, cultural experience that we get to immerse everyone with. But yeah, so that's the street fair. But I wanted to let Rose and Steve give their comments or questions.
So, Rose, how about if you ask a question first?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I mean, I take my hat off to you. It's incredible what you're doing. I'm so impressed. I mean, it's just fantastic. So no criticism at all. I just want to ask about something slightly different. I work with a nonprofit that operates basically in the San Fernando Valley, and we have drop-ins, and we serve hundreds and hundreds of people. I mean, on a normal day, we'll have 70 or 80 breakfast lunches we give out. I mean, we're serving a lot of people. A lot of them come from Skid Row because it's a very easy ride on the Red Line. They just come straight up to Universal and just walk up Lancashire and they're with us. So we're all, I mean, we don't have anything to do with the Midnight Mission so we're not dealing with people who are kind of within a setting like that. I mean, our people at the end of the drop-in, they go somewhere. We have a lot of outreach workers as well. It's complicated. Anyway, my question, sorry, I just wanted to give you some background because it's a slightly different program we use. My job, well, one of my jobs is when we get new people, kind of to interview them, find out what's going on. And we get a lot of musicians, and I'm really serious musicians. I mean, we had one, I can't remember where he'd been, I think it was Juilliard. I mean, he was so talented, and he had dropped out kind of in his second or third year. He had a little keyboard that he kind of was able to carry around with him all the time, and he played it. So my first question is there some way I could connect somebody like that with you? I mean, he's not a beginning musician. This guy's was way up there. I mean, he was amazing. And he's not the only one. I mean, it's like a truism. You know, you go to LA and you're going to become a film star or whatever. And the ones that end up homeless, I seem to meet a lot of them, and they have talent. They have no idea where to go, what to do. And I don't think they fit in the mission, because quite honestly, I don't think they're drug addicts or anything like that. I mean, you talk about addiction a lot, both of you, but I don't think all the people I work with are by any means, or maybe occasionally. Anyway, sorry, I'm talking too long. I just want some answers, some ideas of contacts.
No, yeah, thank you so much. And to be clear, especially when working in Skid Row, I've found that oftentimes people end up on the street through a myriad of reasons, sometimes very slowly, but often drugs kind of get into the mix after that point, especially when you've been on the street for many years, potentially. You're cold, you're hungry, like, so not to say that all people go to because of addiction first, sometimes it's the other way around, but yes.
And then to your, sorry, Kendall, you want to continue?
I was just going to say quickly, yeah, we see a lot of very talented musicians in Skid, and it's just like crazy the amount of people that you speak to and hearing their last, like how their life used to be before this chapter. Truly all different walks of life, super talented people. Vijay?
One of the areas of development for Street Symphony now is to be able to host our own workshops independent of our partnerships with a mission or shelter. And we literally just had a staff meeting 2 days ago where we talked about individuals like the people you're meeting, Rose, because these are individuals who may not want or need to come to the Midnight Mission for services. They may not be able to seek services at a place like the Downtown Women's Center. You know, many of the missions have, for reasons of boundaries or protection or privacy, a lot of reasons why people who don't fit into those programs actually don't find a place to belong within those programs. So one of our future dreams for Street Symphony is to have a space of our own where we can curate and program our own events and actually partner with other community organizations, whether it's a meal service or a hygiene center or a mental health agency or just a place for people to come and land and make music. And that's one of the things that we really want to create. But, you know, Rose, perhaps, you know, Kendall has put her email and phone number in the chat here. we'd love to come and visit and see the community that you're working with, because although Street Symphony is deeply invested in the Skid Row community, we're constantly aware of the fact that, Skid Row is kind of like the center of a web. A lot of people, might come to Skid Row because that's where they're going to have the interview with an agent for their SSI or SRO housing, but they might not really want to be living in downtown Los Angeles. And so they find home somewhere in between the various different service points. One of the other things that we're hoping to create at some point is a deeper partnership with the Department of Mental Health, which have created new peer-to-peer resource centers all over the county. And, now the Department of Mental Health is going to be taking on mental health resources for the entirety of LA County Sheriff's Department with regards to reentry mental health services. So the peer-to-peer networking for individuals post being in a service is really critical, because the place that we've also seen people fall through the cracks is, someone might be re-emerging into society, re-entering society after 30-year bout of incarceration, and then they live in a re-entry center for 2 years. But after they've been at the re-entry center, they might fall away because their SRO is in Palmdale or in Lancaster or in Whittier, and we don't have services or programs or connections there. So some of those individuals might be coming back to Skid Row for programs and services, but we also have such, Street Symphony has over 90 musicians who are part of our roster of what we do and who are regularly performing. So we're always looking for more partnerships and more communities to serve. So yeah, we'd love to be connected with you and learn about how we can be a better service.
Thank you so much. I will email our director and know that this is over and you might well be hearing from her. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vijay, about that. That was actually a question that I was having, if you had any interest in outreaching other communities, because what you're doing is so impactful on the lives of people in Skid Row, but there are a lot of unhoused people in other communities, including our city of Pasadena, who are talented, and just showing that people with lived experience have these talents can make a real difference.
And
Steve,
just to that point, this is why we're so excited to be presenting our upcoming performance on April 29th at All Saints Church in Pasadena. We were actually very lucky to perform last year's Messiah project at All Saints. We were able to live stream in the Midnight Strings participants from the Midnight Mission to the All Saints room. And it was remarkable to hear Handel's Messiah being performed by LA Phil and LA Master Chorale musicians, and then centering the voices of the Skid Row community. But we had many individuals at that Messiah project who came to the church in Pasadena and said, I live here in Pasadena. I live on the grounds at All Saints. And we've been very lucky to partner with Reverend Mike Kinman and many of the other, spiritual leaders here in Pasadena. And part of the work that Kendall has been doing as part of Street Symphony is to find local connections with organizations, close to the public venues where we're presenting concerts, to better connect people in various other communities with the work that we're doing through our CROSSROADS programs. And CROSSROADS is, an intersection of people like you who might be coming to our concerts for the music or for the community, but also community members themselves. So our hope with the CROSSROADS programs is to put you in direct contact with your community and with service providers like the Midnight Mission or like Union Station or other service providers in the community. So if you're free on the 29th, please come because we'd love to have you.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful.
I wanted to follow up on that and say, if anyone needs the flyer, please email me for it. We are inviting, I believe the Midnight Mission is going to be transporting about a bus of people of our clients in. I'm also in contact with Impact over up in Pasadena. So if anyone has any unhoused or people, friends, or those getting services that would be interested, they're more than welcome to attend, and it is free for them.
Sounds wonderful. I think Steve Rohde, you're next.
Thank you. Vijay, I'm just so thrilled to see you again. I was in the room at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church when you came. You performed. It was thrilling. I bring greetings from David Howard, a very close friend of mine, who, for everyone's benefit, was bass clarinetist for over 40 years at the LA Phil. I also want to tell you, and maybe you know this, that All Saints was the founding connection of ICUJP. It was the Reverend George Regas, the extraordinary leader at All Saints Church, that was the convener of ICUJP now over 21 years ago in the wake of 9/11. And we have been meeting every Friday with a few exceptions for holidays. And you are part of the history of ICUJP, and now you're solidly with us. Do you know Pastor Q? Pastor Q and I work together at the Black Jewish Justice Alliance. And of course, he's an extraordinary leader. Will the April 29 program itself be live streamed? Do you know?
It will not be live streamed, but it will be recorded, and so the recording will be made available. And you know, what's remarkable about these programs is, of course, it's free and open to the communities that Street Symphony serves through our regular programming. But all the proceeds of public tickets go to support Street Symphony's workshop programs. And so that's a way that everyone can become involved in supporting the work that we do and also experiencing some great music. But we will certainly be recording that performance.
So I have a specific question for each of you. Kendall, I gather you're relatively new to your official position at Street Symphony. So what's the scope of your work, and what are your goals and what would you like to achieve now that you're on board there?
So great question. Thank you. So as programs and relations manager, I see my position as kind of two-pronged. On the one side, we have our programs. So I have just been kind of trying to make sure I'm at every single, workshop at Midnight Strings, introducing myself to all of our community partners and trying to kind of understand not just Street Symphony's creator programming structure, but all of the different programs that are happening around us, like in the Skid Row Arts Alliance. I went to a piece-by-piece mosaic workshop the other week. Yesterday, I was at Inner City Arts. So just really kind of working on that sense of community, which then kind of brings me to the relations side. As Vijay said, doing a lot of work, not only to find other partner organizations that we can invite to our programming, but also venues that we can potentially use for concerts or workshops. And just trying to bring it all together. And as for your last question of what I would like to see achieved, two things that I really hope to be able to be a part of is bringing back the Street Symphony block party, which is kind of like the street fair that the Midnight Mission has, but really just leaning into the community more and having it really be like a whole block party, featuring our different artists and community members. So that would be awesome to see. And then probably way more down the line, if there could be like a headquarters for Street Symphony, to actually be able to host workshops and everything, like he was saying, to have people kind of come to us instead of relying on different community partners and their various hours of operation and schedules and everything like that.
Terrific.
I'll just tack on one quick thing just to say that Kendall comes to us from the Midnight Mission. And you know, that her depth of experience and understanding, not only of the organization, one of our closest partners since 2012, but also of the community. I mean, Kendall gets recognized by our Skid Row community. And you know, the thing that we always have to, we the musicians, and I consider myself one of them, of course, always have to keep in mind is that we're guests in this community, and that we get to leave, you know, and holding that understanding is tenuous, because so many musicians will say, well, I feel so guilty. I feel so guilty for leaving and returning to my gorgeous home in Eagle Rock or Echo Park or Altadena, especially because, as you can imagine, many of the audiences for whom we play in Skid Row are some of the most rewarding musical experiences we've ever had. I, you know, talked about what it was like to play Beethoven in Skid Row, and David Howard and I have played Mozart and Brahms in various different Skid Row facilities. We've also played at the Path facilities in North Hollywood. You know, there are audiences there who give us their souls, and their responses are so generous and so loving that, you know, sometimes when I would return back to the concert hall, I would feel like I wanted that sense of connection, and I have to remind myself, oh, right, I can't talk to this audience. I can't ask them what they're feeling the same way I can talk to an audience in a Skid Row shelter or clinic. So, you know, Kendall's role really anchors Street Symphony in maintaining our human connection, rooted in human services and clinical services, to the work that we do. You know, one of the other sort of liaison points that we're always thinking about is with clinicians and social workers and caseworkers. You know, at Street Symphony, we're not collecting data, you know, on impact and metrics and analyses. And as much as we want to make sure that our programs are understood for the impact that they have, the most meaningful place of generating and collecting that impact is actually in collaboration with social workers, providers, and caseworkers. And if we can actually really work with them to identify what are the parameters that they're hoping to look at and accomplish and gauge as people are moving through their programs, that's what we really care about. So Kendall's also a liaison for program staff and overworked, tired, exhausted social workers who are just some of the most amazing real life angels that we've met today. So I'll just tack that on to what's already on her shoulders.
Thank you. My specific question to you, Vijay, and you touched on it, putting statistics aside, stories and narratives are what is powerful. You've been at this over 10 years, if I'm correct. Do you have some follow-up stories of individuals that have participated in your workshops, attended your concerts, that have been touched by Street Symphony, and what the transformation or the arc of their lives has been as a result?
You know, one of the first reasons I got involved in making music in Skid Row was, of course, the story of Nathaniel Ayers, who I'm sure everyone is familiar with. It was told by Steve Lopez in his book, The Soloist, which got turned into the movie. And I used to make music with Nathaniel everywhere, all over, you know, downtown Los Angeles. He was kind of my guide to Skid Row. And if you remember in the book, there is not the sort of gilded ride into the sunset Hollywood ending for Nathaniel. Nathaniel is, you know, currently in a locked facility in Whittier, and that was you know, something that I don't know if the public is quite aware of. You know, Steve talks a lot about redemption in the book, and early on in the work at Street Symphony, I was very interested in trying to find other people like Nathaniel. And Rose, you just mentioned this Juilliard trained musician who plays the keyboard, you know, and there are other people like him out there. But what is the sort of end goal of what we're trying to achieve? Because the truth is, the sad truth is, that there's often not the white picket fence middle-class American dream waiting for individuals on the other side of participating in programs in Skid Row, whether it's Street Symphony or coming through a program like the Midnight Mission. One of the most sort of successful, if I could say, stories of Street Symphony involves an individual named Ben Shirley. And Ben was a bass player in a death metal band that used to open for Metallica. And Ben ended up seeking services at the Midnight Mission. And in fact, he was also a classically trained composer. And when Ben was living at the Midnight Mission, he started composing again as part of his pathway to sobriety. And at our Messiah project, as well as at future programs, we started to weave Ben's music into our programs. That was around the time that Street Symphony started something called our Fellows program, where we would work with musicians from the Skid Row community and pair them with professional teaching artists on our roster for 2 years of intensive weekly one-on-one lessons. And that Fellows program resulted in people like Ben eventually joining the staff of Street Symphony. Ben became our very first composer in residence. And then later on, he became our first director of community engagement. And, you know, as I mentioned before, when I was talking about sobriety with Dr. Ruby, you know, growth often means leaving the community. And so Ben was able to move to Granville, Ohio, where he now lives, and he continues his work of, you know, creating music. He actually just came back to the Midnight Mission for a performance where he brought in the amazing clarinetist Anthony McGill, who's the principal clarinet of the New York Philharmonic, to perform with the Pacifica String Quartet, a piece that Ben had been commissioned to write by the Pacifica String Quartet. And Anthony and Pacifica actually first heard about Ben through Street Symphony's program. So that's one of the greatest stories that I have to tell about Street Symphony. But I also have to tell the story of a man named Brian Palmer, who was one of Street Symphony's fellows who performed and was actually written about in the New Yorker as performing an aria from Handel's Messiah. And Brian had come to Street Symphony with, you know, a month clean from a 7-year heroin addiction. And he had been paired with a Street Symphony teaching artist. And a few years after he performed with Street Symphony, Brian died of an accidental overdose. And that broke our hearts. And it was shattering to that narrative. You know, Steve, you're very right to say that so often the real transformation exists in understanding the stories. And, you know, that another thing that we've learned from being involved with people who have had experiences of recovery in whatever kind, doesn't have to necessarily be a recovery from addiction, is that this work is really about the relationship. You know, it's as much about my change and the change of my staff and my colleagues and my musicians as it is the change that we want to see enacted upon the people we're playing for. I think that's where the redemption narrative or the charity narrative often falls apart, because, you know, I think it's the indigenous scholar Lila Watson who said, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let's work together. If you're here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let's work together. And that reminds me of the beautiful words that Carol Francis was saying at the beginning of our call, that this has been part of indigenous wisdom for millennia, if not more than millennia, in the sense that we are not separate from the world that we are inhabiting. And that's very much the way that I see the ecosystems, plural ecosystems of Skid Row and of Street Symphony, that this is a place of spiritual and artistic practice. It's a place of practice. And that's the way I think about Street Symphony now.
Thank you, Vijay. Lucy Bailey, you've had your hand up for quite a while. Would you ask your question now?
I want to put my hand down but I'll just say quickly, y'all were talking about outreach. Yesterday, now that we're on stories, I got on the bus and there was a man walking down the middle of the street and getting honked at and everything. And I said, oh no, sure enough, he sat next to me on the bus stop and with his little bracelet from just having been released from the hospital, I assume. And because my friend has just written an ode to Greta for Earth Day, and it involves singing and dancing in the street, this piece that my friend Rick Tagawa has written. I said to this man, who I was a little afraid of because he was talking to himself, I said, do you want to sing? I said to him. And he launched into a rap, some tunes that he was sure I would know. And then he launched into a dialogue between himself and whoever it is that has been telling him that you quote, "You have so much music inside of you. Why don't you go to Hollywood and get involved?" And then he continued on with a lot of things that I did not understand. But that little bit where we were sitting on the bus stop waiting for the bus made me today think, listening to Vijay and y'all need to get on the bus and reach out to the Metro and to the Big Blue Bus, because there are people that need, obviously, a place to come play and sing. Thank you for that.
What a gorgeous recommendation, Lucy. I mean, that's so beautiful. And, you know, it's actually been one of our dreams at one point to actually create like the Street Symphony food truck or the Street Symphony mobile band, the performing truck of some kind, where we could actually take our show on the road and be playing all over the city. But, you know, the points of engagement, the points of humanity, it's so, that's what's so miraculous, right? I think, you know, creating this lens of connection.
The music does it, the soul, like you're saying. And the bus does go all over the county. The Metro goes all over the county and all over the city. So I'm going to ask y'all if you've had success in that venue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this. It's really inspiring. Of course, I heard the story of Beethoven going deaf, but I never heard the story of his letters saying that that's artist the reason he's staying alive. And of course, I've heard the story of the king standing during the Messiah, but I had never heard where it was performed and the whole thing about the orphanage. And I did hear about Vivaldi working in orphanages. And I wonder how many of these stories that we haven't heard, that we've heard their music. But I'm wondering, do you share these stories with the street musicians when you start learning their music? And does it bring out a kind of, oh, it's like me or she's like me? And does that play into a conversation leading into the music?
You know, Carol Francis, it's a brilliant question. And that actually has informed not only how we engage with our audiences in Skid Row, but specifically what I curate musically as the artistic director. You know, so often there is an unvoiced, unheard story of fragile, vulnerable humanity behind the pieces of music that we love. I should be clear that Street Symphony has expanded radically from classical music alone. We also perform and play reggae and jazz and mariachi music, West African drumming, as Kendall mentioned. But of course, my heart and soul is rooted as a classically trained violinist in the music of the Western classical masters. And I've actually created a sort of a program around playing a piece of music for an audience and then asking them, what do you hear? What's going on in your mind? What are you seeing? What images, what emotions are you seeing? What do you think the person who wrote this was going through? And without fail, the audience that we're playing for will reverse engineer the biography of Schumann, who died in an asylum. We were playing Schumann in Twin Towers jail, and one of the inmates said, "Oh, it's fitting that you're playing Schumann because Schumann died in a place like this." Or when we play Brahms, or we play Schubert, you know, Schubert, who was grappling with his sexuality, who couldn't be out and gay in his life, but died at age 29 from syphilis, that he contracted from an underage male prostitute, you know, and this music of regret and vulnerability and fragility that's in Schubert. There's something there that connects with an audience. So we start and lead with the stories of this music. And, you know, for me, I don't understand for the life of me why we don't do that in the hall as well. because I feel like we talk a lot about, quote, the death of classical music. And I think that this music has, first of all, it survived for millennia. So of course it's going to keep surviving, but why should it survive? And what's the story that we're telling through this music? You know, we just had Easter last week. And, you know, we hear, of course, the passions of Bach, St. Matthew Passion, St. John Passion. But I think we don't remember the fact that these were pieces of music that were written for a community. They were never written for the concert hall. The concert hall did not exist in Bach's time. The concert hall did not exist until the mid-19th century. And so when Bach's passions were performed for his congregation in Leipzig or Weimar or Eisenach in Germany, everyone in the audience sang along with the hymn tunes that were being presented and embedded in that music. So we were playing liturgical music in a vernacular sense. We're playing liturgical music in a vernacular sense. So the question that Street Symphony is really trying to ask now, that I'm trying to ask as artistic director, is what is our modern day liturgy? What is our modern day liturgy? How do we get everyone in the room singing, right? And how do we get everyone in the room engaged with the liturgy? And for me, the liturgy, the leader of the liturgy is the community. The community's voice to me is sacred, which is why when we present a Bach cantata or we present Handel's Messiah, the music is actually garlanding the voice of the community, which to me is what is actually sacred here. And so when, you know, Linda Lee, who I mentioned before, who's a former resident of the Union Rescue Mission and has worked in the Downtown Women's Center and still lives and works in Skid Row, you know, we did a project last year that set one of Bach's most beautiful, beloved cantatas, the cantata 82, Ich habe genug, which in German means I am fulfilled, I've had enough. And it's actually telling the story of Simeon, this character in the Bible, Simeon, who beholds the infant Jesus 40 days after Jesus' birth and says, oh, I've seen the Savior. I've held him in my hands and now I have enough. I can meet my death. I have enough. I'm fulfilled. I'm fulfilled. Linda, in the context of that liturgy, told the story of getting housing for the first time and how the 2 little chocolates on her bed were enough to remind herself that someone still cared about her, that was enough. And so what we did at that performance is that we put 2 little chocolates on everyone's chair in the audience, you know, just as a little sweet reminder of our humanity, you know. And so that's the kind of thing that it just lights me on fire, because in that way, the music of Bach is still the lifeline that I want to share with audiences, but it makes the music and liturgy of Bach relevant to the world that we're living in now. It was never meant as something to be consumed on the stage of a concert hall. It was meant as soul food. So in that way, I'm hoping to return Street Symphony to that beautiful thing that Kendall said. You know, we really do believe that this is an opportunity for all of us to be nourished by the music we create.
I just wanted to tell like a very small story based on that, because I think everyone here would really appreciate it. Probably, I don't know, 6 months ago, when I was at the Midnight Mission, there was a Music with the Mission performance by Street Symphony. I can't remember which ensemble it was, but it was a classical one. And in the middle of the performance, when Vijay kind of stops everything and is asking for a piano player playing Mendelssohn. So when Vijay kind of stops and is asking for feedback, this person in the back of the room raised their hands and said that they had written a poem based, like just sitting there listening to the music. They had written like a poem and they wanted to know if they could stand up and read it. Vijay said, yes, of course. And they read it. And it was just like, I think I have a picture of it somewhere, but it was just like so moving, so deep. And obviously this person's talented. So I went up afterward and I approached them and I kind of had a suspicion. So I asked what their pronouns were and she said she, her. and said her preferred name is India. And she is transgender, but was in our men's floor. And so you could tell that she's kind of quiet to herself, and going up to her and, asking what her pronouns are, asking what her name is, just really like, that was so talented. You should join Midnight Strings. That's the point of introduction. If you want to perform at the next one, you should join Midnight Strings, songwriting, this and that. Probably about 20, 30 minutes later, when I was walking to my office, I see her outside her caseworker's office, quietly crying. And I went and talked to Georgia about it, and Georgia went and spoke with her just to make sure she's okay. And apparently she said that she's crying because she has never felt more seen in her life. And she was just like so deeply moved by just such small interactions. She did come to Midnight Strings, and she ended up being a feature, like a core feature of that cohort. And that poem, I think it was that poem that she wrote, or a different poem, went on to, well, Vijay, you explain about the music part.
Well, I will. I should just briefly say that India, you saw her in the video. She was wiping tears from her eyes in that video. And I don't think she gave an interview, but you can go back to the video and watch it. India wrote a poem called Relinquish. And that was actually set to music and premiered at Street Symphony's Messiah project. And that to us is, that's the point. That's what we live for. Because that, being able to take that music and center it, and that expression and center it along the work that we love to create. It's the story that we've been telling you about for the last hour or so. So that to us is sacred. That's the in-between where God exists and where justice and peace can happen, because we're creating a sense of wholeness. That's where I and my soul and all of us, we just come alive there.
Wow. Well, thank you, Vijay and Kendall. This has been an extraordinary experience. It's more than just a presentation. Feel like you've shared your souls with us, the music. I don't know if I mentioned that going to the Midnight Mission and hearing Handel's Messiah and hearing the story about Handel that you shared today was just a transforming experience to me. I'd heard Handel's Messiah maybe 100 times, but I felt I heard it for the first time and really heard it at Midnight Mission when it was performed by you and your musicians.